There is no disease that the medical writer has to describe which presents a more melancholy scene than the natural smallpox, as it very frequently occurs. Stated a medical textbook published in 1803. The symptoms began with pain and debilitation, a terrible feeling of anxiety, followed by high temperature, unquenchable thirst, inflammation of the eyes, violent sweating, and convulsions. Many speck-like spots resembling flea bites would appear, becoming red and painful. These then turned to pustules, accompanied by throat inflammation, salivation, and diarrhea. The eyelids would swell and stick together, causing loss of sight by the 7th day. The 8th day would find the spots full of yellow pus or fluid, which eroded the skin. Sleep was fitful and disturbed, with each morning bringing a horrid scene of gore mingled with corruption. Death often released the sufferer between the 14th and the 17th day, with those who recovered left scarred for life and often blind. This was smallpox, responsible for 10% of all deaths and up to 35% of all childhood deaths, when Edward Jenner embarked upon a career in medicine towards the end of the 18th century. The town of Berkeley in Gloucestershire has more claims to fame than anyone would expect at first glance. The landscape is dominated by an imposing 12th century Norman castle, famous for its part in the gruesome murder of Edward II. In more recent history, the Berkeley nuclear power station brought controversy to disturb the town's rural tranquility. And it wasn't the first time that progressive science had touched the lives of Berkeley's inhabitants. 200 years ago, this house, the Chantry, in the shadow of Berkeley Castle and overlooked by the church, was the setting for one of the greatest scientific discoveries of all time. The retiring country doctor who lived here from the mid-1780s until 1823 was none other than Edward Jenner, the founding father of immunology. His inquiring mind and great observational skills were put to good use, and when he published a medical paper in 1798, he changed the course of history.
This is that publication. In the fashion of the day, its title is quite lengthy. An inquiry into the causes and effects of the variolae vaccinae, a disease discovered in some of the western counties of England, particularly Gloucestershire, and known by the name of the cowpox. It's been estimated that this publication by Edward Jenner has saved more human lives than the work of any other person. It's seen by many as the very foundation on which has been built one of medicine's most important cornerstones, immunology. Immunology gives us the basis of our understanding of vaccination, allergy, transplantation, and diseases such as AIDS and rheumatoid arthritis. But in most people's eyes, this document has made an even greater impact on this planet. It began the process by which one of the most feared diseases that mankind has had to endure was scientifically hunted down and destroyed. It has led directly to the total worldwide eradication of smallpox, the first major disease for which this could be claimed. Dr. Edward Jenner is very rightly honoured throughout the world as the man who began this path to knowledge and success in medicine. Yet, remarkably, I would contend that even if smallpox had never existed to challenge Jenner's intellect, we would still remember him today for many other achievements. For this shy country doctor who lived here 2 centuries ago also made important contributions to our understanding of bird migration, the hibernation of the hedgehog, the nesting habits of the cuckoo, and the connection between hardening of the arteries and angina. He was the first person in Britain to launch a balloon, and he discovered the first dinosaur skeleton in Britain, a plesiosaurus.
Edward Jenner was born in 1749 at the Old Vicarage, Berkeley. His father was the Reverend Stephen Jenner, Vicar of Berkeley, and his mother, Sarah, herself the daughter of a clergyman, suffered the terrible heartbreak of child mortality, an experience shared by many of their fellow parishioners. But by today's standards, Edward Jenner's childhood can only be described as tragic. 2 weeks before Edward was born, Sarah, heavily pregnant, had buried her fourth son, also named Edward, aged just 5 years. The fact that she'd lost another son at the age of 2.5 in 1736 would have made this even harder to bear, and whether the arrival of a second Edward was a consolation or a sad reminder of the little boy's loss, we can only guess. Certainly the surviving children, Mary 19, Stephen 17, Henry 13, Sarah 11 and Anne 8, were old enough to have felt the loss of a brother, and the girls would have been enlisted to help with the care of young Edward. Tragedy didn't strike the family again until the winter of 1754, when in October Sarah gave birth to a 9th child, a boy christened Thomas on the 8th, but buried the next day. Sarah died the following day, the 10th of October, aged 46. Stephen Jenner only outlived his wife by 2 months, dying on the 9th of December at the age of 52. Devastating as this was, it was nothing out of the ordinary for the time, and Edward, orphaned at the age of 5, was fortunate in having sisters to care for him and brothers to look after his financial needs. In 1757, Mary, the eldest sister, married the Reverend Charles Black, who had succeeded her father as Vicar of Berkeley. This coincided with the beginning of 8-year-old Edward's education. For all of his difficult start in life, Edward had enjoyed living in the country, having developed a keen interest in wildlife and fossils. It was an interest that would remain with him for the rest of his days. The Latin and Greek which schools in Wootton-under-Edge and Cirencester had to offer came a poor second. Smallpox was first to touch Edward Jenner's life while he was at school. Deliberately infecting a healthy person with supposedly mild smallpox was the only weapon that medical practitioners had to offer to control the dreaded disease, and Edward was duly infected along with his school fellows. The experience was to torment Jenner for years after the illness. He found it hard to sleep and was constantly haunted by imaginary noises. Physically, he escaped with a mild case of smallpox, but without the comfort of his family, shut away with other boys who had been infected with the disease, the psychological implications were horrendous. The memories were never to leave him, and no doubt contributed to Jenner's preoccupation with smallpox in later years. By the age of 12, it had become evident that following his brothers to college at Oxford wasn't an appropriate course for Edward. He was far more interested in the nests of dormice and fossil collections than anything a classical education had to offer. In the late 18th century, medicine was at least practical, as well as being connected to the physical world. This made it a logical option for Edward and his inquisitive mind. One way of training in medicine required a student to be apprenticed to a surgeon, and in his early teens, Edward Jenner went as apprentice to George Hardwick and Daniel Ludlow at Chipping Sodbury to embark on his medical career. There's little information about the 6 years that Jenner spent with Ludlow, but it's probable, knowing Jenner's character, that he had a natural affinity for his subject. Serving an apprenticeship required Jenner to develop his observational skills, and it was during this time that a seed of an idea was planted which would germinate and grow over the next 30 years. This letter, written by one of Jenner's friends in 1817, gives an account of the first time Jenner spotted a link between cowpox and smallpox. About the year 1768, he learnt that there was a report rife in the dairies of a distemper named the cowpox, which infested the teats of milk cows and infected the hands of the milkers, being sometimes a preventative of smallpox. Even at the young age of 19, Jenner was keen to discuss his finding, but Ludlow, by all accounts, dismissed the idea. Fortunately for the rest of the world, Jenner was never to forget the story of the Chipping Sodbury milkmaids. At the end of his 6-year apprenticeship, Jenner would have been eligible to set himself up in practice as a surgeon. This was fine for the country town of Berkeley. No other qualifications were required. However, Jenner obviously had a taste for the theory behind medicine, and to the benefit of a private income, let him continue his studies. Ludlow's son had studied in London with a surgeon called John Hunter, and it was to Hunter, the chief surgeon at St. George's Hospital, that Jenner enrolled as a student in the autumn of 1770.
In Jenner's day, surgeons formed the backbone of medicine. They understood the anatomical structure of the body and the circulation of the blood. These could be learned by dissection and observation. They used this knowledge to perform corrective surgery, without the benefits of anaesthetics, of course. Patients were frequently bled by cutting or applying leeches in an attempt to ease symptoms. Without a knowledge of antisepsis and antibiotics, amputations were often the only remedy for the consequences of even minor injuries. The subtleties of the functions of organs in health and disease were much less understood. John Hunter was one of the first to promote the idea that changes to the organs in disease could be important aids to diagnosis and perhaps treatment. He stressed the value of observation and experimentation and began a great collection of medical specimens, which is still of value to researchers today. He wrote to Jenner, "I thank you for your experiment on the hedgehog, but why do you ask me a question by the way of solving it? I think your solution is just, but why think? Why not try the experiment?" The time spent with Hunter also helped Jenner to develop socially. Hunter's wife Anne was a poet whose work had been set to music by Haydn. Jenner himself developed a reputation as a minor poet, and he was always welcome at parties because he played the flute and the violin.
It's evident that Hunter held his pupil in high esteem, and there was an incident while Jenner was with him which highlights this. In 1771, Captain Cook returned to England aboard his ship the Endeavour after his first great round-the-world voyage of scientific discovery, which had lasted 3 years. The chief botanist, Joseph Banks, known to John Hunter through the Royal Society, had brought back thousands of specimens and hundreds of drawings by the ship's artist. These all needed cataloguing, and as Jenner was skilled in anatomical presentation and dissection, Hunter recommended his pupil to Banks. Joseph Banks seems to have been well pleased with Jenner's work, and when Captain Cook planned a second voyage, Banks asked Jenner to accompany him. Jenner declined the offer, telling a friend that he was very attached to the rural scenes and habits of his early youth, as well as feeling that he owed it to his family to return to Berkeley. This was precisely what he did, and at the age of 23, Edward Jenner may well have been the most qualified doctor that Berkeley could ever have boasted. He dealt with disease and fever, as well as the common digestive, skin and heart problems of the day. He based his fees upon the distance he needed to travel to see his patients, which he did on horseback over an area of up to 400 square miles. Jenner was again fortunate in many ways because of his family connections. As a landowner, he received an income, and he was provided with a home by his older brother Stephen, who had never married. This gave him the time to pursue his scientific interests, as well as the social life for which his years with the Hunters had also given him a taste. It was about this time that Jenner met Edward Gardner, a wine merchant from Frampton-upon-Severn. The two became friends, sharing an interest in poetry as well as in good wine. It was here on the Green, where the Bell Inn still stands just as it did in the late 18th century, that Gardner and Jenner first met. Gardner's description of Jenner gives us an interesting view of the young doctor. When I first saw him, it was on Frampton Green. His height was rather under the middle size. His person was robust but active and, well-formed. In dress he was particularly neat, and everything about him showed the man intent and serious, and well prepared to meet the duties of his calling. There are other clues to Jenner's character development, and one incident which happened in the early stages of his career back at Berkeley is most informative. Jenner was a guest at a large dinner party in Bath. A discussion arose about which part of the candle flame was the hottest. This is an account of what happened. Jenner desired the candle to be placed near him, and immediately put his finger into the flame, suffering it to remain some time. Next, he put his finger above it, but was obliged to snatch it away immediately. "This, gentleman," said he, "is a sufficient test." Experiment and observation had been put to good use. The next day, one of the guests, a General Smith, who had been most impressed by Jenner's scientific approach, offered him a medical appointment in India. This would have been a wonderful opportunity for Jenner, but yet again he declined, preferring to remain in Berkeley rather than travel the world. Despite the distance between Berkeley and London, Hunter did not allow his former pupil to neglect his studies. There was a lively correspondence between the two, but sadly only the letters from Hunter to Jenner still exist. Although speculative, it seems as if Jenner had written to Hunter about a big disappointment in love. As always, Hunter had practical advice to offer. "I own I was at a loss to account for your silence, and I'm sorry at the cause. I can easily conceive how you must feel, for you have two passions to cope with, viz. That of being disappointed in love, and that of being defeated. But both will wear out, perhaps the first soonest. I own that I was glad when I heard you was moored to a woman of fortune, but let her go, and never mind her. I shall employ you with hedgehogs." Hedgehogs were to prove an alternative passion for Jenner. He worked on many experiments, sometimes under Hunter's direction, at other times as a result of his own observations. Jenner was particularly fascinated by their hibernation, a concept that was little understood in the 18th century. Birds were also a great interest of Jenner's, and he was puzzled by the general belief of the day that they, like hedgehogs, hibernated too. It was thought that the birds slept under mud, water, or even ice in the colder weather. Jenner watched the birds reappear in the spring and found the theory highly improbable. Why, if the birds had hibernated, did they reappear in the English skies, fat, healthy, and in good condition? After the long winter sleep, hedgehogs were often in poor condition, and if food was scarce, and the hedgehog's fat deposits inadequate, it would be touch and go whether they survived. If birds did hibernate, they would be subject to the same rules of nature, and to Jenner this plainly was not the case. He'd also noticed birds flying out at sea, for which he knew there must be a reason. Observation, as always, was to provide the answer, and Jenner established that birds migrated to warmer climates through the colder winter months. Jenner's work on bird migration was never published during his lifetime, a task undertaken by his family in 1823, just after his death. It was perhaps this interest in bird migration that led Jenner to contemplate the behaviour of that most seasonable of birds, the cuckoo. Jenner was intrigued by the puzzle of the cuckoo's nesting habits. It raised so many questions. Why would cuckoo parents desert their own young? How were the rightful chicks removed from the nest? And why did the foster parents fail to notice their well-fed baby was not their own? As Jenner put it himself, "This subject has puzzled philosophers in every age, from the days of Aristotle." Here, as with his cowpox theory, Jenner thought about cuckoos for many years before initiating his research. He began his study by locating a number of nests, mostly of hedge sparrows, that contained cuckoo eggs. By this time, Jenner was pretty busy with his medical practice and enlisted the help of his 16-year-old nephew, Henry. The nests were mostly on a farm at Clapton, about 3 miles away from Berkeley, and to watch the nests for progress every morning required Henry to complete a 6-mile circuit. Without supervision, this long walk diminished Henry's motivation, and he was perhaps too ready to make assumptions which he reported back to Jenner. Jenner could well have been eager to get his paper on the subject published, writing it up for submission to the Royal Society by way of Hunter. He accurately described the cuckoos laying their eggs in the nests of other birds. He was correct also in the manner of feeding by the foster parents of the demanding cuckoo chick. But where he missed the mark, due perhaps to Henry's poor research, was his statement that the foster parents ejected their own young from the nest to exclusively care for the solitary cuckoo. Jenner offered no explanation for this strange behaviour. Something must have still been niggling at Jenner, because despite the completion of the paper, he continued to watch the cuckoo's nests for himself. His findings were astounding. He watched as a tiny cuckoo chick hoisted all of the other occupants of the nest onto its back, one by one, pitching them out to certain death. It didn't matter whether it was eggs or hatched chicks. The results were the same. A single cuckoo chick remained in the nests. Jenner also described what happened when 2 cuckoo hatchlings were in the same nest. The contest was very remarkable. The combatants alternately appeared to have the advantage, as each carried the other several times to the top of the nest, and then sunk down again, oppressed by the weight of its burden, till at length, after various efforts, the strongest prevailed. Not content with just knowing what the cuckoo chicks did, Jenner went further, using dissection to discover a dip in the cuckoo's back, which disappeared about 12 days after hatching, by which time its destructive work would be complete. Jenner revised his paper accordingly, sending it to Hunter in December 1787 and asking him to present it to the Royal Society. Hunter obliged, and despite the false start, Observations on the Natural History of the Cuckoo earned Jenner election as a Fellow of the Royal Society in February 1789, just before his 40th birthday. This process took more than a year, but it took even longer for Jenner's observations to be confirmed, following the introduction of moving picture film in the 1920s. The range of Jenner's scientific interest was certainly broad, with the work of the French air ballooning Montgolfier brothers in the 1780s coming to his attention. Without doubt, the first flight on the English side of the Channel took place in 1783 under Jenner's supervision. With the help of his friend, the Earl of Berkeley, and the use of the Great Hall in Berkeley Castle, they filled a silk balloon with hydrogen, probably manufactured from iron filings and sulfuric acid. It was launched successfully, landing at Kingscote some miles away, where the Kingscote family were present for its relaunch. The presence of one member of the family, Catherine Kingscote, would have delighted Jenner, because she may well have been the woman of fortune that Hunter directed Jenner to let go in favour of the hedgehogs. The Kingscotes were a wealthy family, and despite the fact that Jenner loved Catherine and she him, a country doctor in the early stages of his career would not have been thought a suitable match. From Kingscote, the balloon soared high over the Cotswold Escarpment, finally coming to rest at the top of Crickley Hill, where the air balloon pub, named after this very incident, still stands today. Jenner was persistent, and Catherine constant, so eventually the Kingscote family gave their permission for the marriage to take place on the 6th of March 1788. The couple started their married life at the Chantry, bought by Jenner 3 years earlier for £600. Both of them loved this house, and although Catherine's health was never robust, they were happily suited. The correspondence and close bond between Hunter and Jenner continued, even when Hunter's health deteriorated. Jenner was very concerned, as he recognised Hunter's symptoms as being caused by angina, a condition little understood but usually fatal. Jenner chose not to discuss his suspicions with Hunter for fear of distressing him, even choosing not to publish his own work on the hardening of arteries. Ironically, if he had, Jenner may well have been the first to document the disease. However, it would appear that Hunter knew only too well what was wrong with him, saying, "My life is in the hands of any fool who cares to upset me." This was an accurate prediction. In October 1793, Hunter lost his temper with colleagues at St. George's Hospital. Soon after, he collapsed and died. A great loss for the world of medicine, and also for Dr. Jenner of Berkeley. The emotional and professional mentor who had spurred him on to such great achievements had gone. instance, smallpox and cowpox were never far from Jenner's thoughts, almost to the point of obsession. Not surprisingly then, that when a case of cowpox, actually quite a rarity, was reported in the area, Jenner took full advantage of it, following Hunter's advice to put theory to the test. A cow called Blossom started the whole process, infecting a young milkmaid called Sarah Nelms through a thorn scratch on her hand in May 1796. For Jenner, there was only one logical experiment needed to prove his theory that cowpox would offer protection against smallpox. He needed some of the pus from the sores on Sarah's hand so that he could infect someone else. The other person was chosen carefully by Jenner. In his own words, "The more accurately to observe the progress of the infection, I selected a healthy boy." The healthy boy was one James Phipps, aged 8, the son of Jenner's gardener. This was important because Jenner needed to be sure that the boy had never had smallpox or cowpox. As the local doctor, Jenner, of course, knew Phipps's medical history. On the 14th of May 1796, Dr. Jenner made 2 small scratches on James's arm, and into these he rubbed the pale liquid from Sarah's pustules. About 4 days later, James developed 2 cowpox pustules where the scratches had been made. He also suffered a mild fever, which subsided after a day or 2. Had it worked? Would this technique really offer protection against smallpox? This was the big question, and a critical one for young James. On the 1st of July 1796, James Phipps went through the procedure for a second time, but on this occasion it was not the mild cowpox that was used, it was the deadly smallpox. Once the procedure was completed, the results were by no means instantaneous. Smallpox took 14 days to develop, so 2 weeks of carefully watching James Phipps for symptoms of the disease would have made for a very long fortnight. Jenner must have erred on the side of caution, because it wasn't until the 19th of July, 18 days later, that he wrote this letter to his friend Edward Gardner. A boy of the name of Phipps was inoculated in the arm from the pustule on the hand of a young woman who was infected by her master's cows. Having never seen the disease but in its casual way before, that is, when communicated from the cow to the hand of the milker, I was astonished at the close resemblance of the pustules in some of their stages to the smallpox pustules. But now, listen to the most delightful part of my story. The boy has since been inoculated for the smallpox, which, as I ventured to predict, produced no effect. I shall now pursue my experiments with redoubled ardour. Good news! But what if Jenner had not been proven correct? What if James Phipps had caught smallpox and died? In today's well-regulated world of medical experimentation, this behaviour would result in prosecution, possibly even a murder charge. But this is an instance where history needs to be put into context, because Jenner was only using a much-practised medical procedure when he inoculated young James with smallpox. Jenner himself had undergone the same treatment as a child, and as this technique of giving smallpox in a controlled environment, known as variolation, was the only weapon physicians had to combat the disease, it was widely used. If Jenner had not given smallpox as part of his experiment with James Phipps, it's probable that the boy would have been variolated at some stage anyway. Jenner was, as is evident from his letter to Gardner, delighted with the result of his experiment. He'd probably first spotted the link between cowpox and smallpox when he was an 18-year-old student. It took him until the age of 47 to prove the connection and exploit it in order to control smallpox. As a doctor, Jenner was already very successful. A few years before the appearance of cowpox in Berkeley, the Jenners had taken a house in the spa town of Cheltenham, some 20 miles away, for the summer. What was planned as a summer holiday for the now growing family with son Edward and baby daughter Catherine proved to be very useful for Jenner's career. The town was becoming a very popular watering place for the rich and famous because of the reputed benefits to health from its natural springs. As the diet of the well-to-do at this time was very rich, the extremely strong laxative qualities of the spa waters would have done much to render the imbiber a great deal more comfortable. This was in fact the reason why many people found that their health improved after a stay in Cheltenham. Society in the town was therefore made up of wealthy visitors in search of cures for their various ailments. There could be no doubting the opportunities that a Cheltenham practice could offer a doctor of Jenner's calibre, and as he had already acquired a degree from St Andrew's University, there was nothing to stand in his way. The house he took, 8 St George's Place, was built in 1795 and was described as being inhabited by families of the highest distinction. Jenner may well have watched the terrace of elegant houses being built before selecting a suitable premise. Sadly, the disregard for historical buildings which characterised much of the property development in the 1960s took its toll. Despite campaigning that Jenner himself would have been proud of, the house was demolished in 1969. For Jenner, the great mental and social stimulation of the type he had experienced with the hunters back in his student days, available in Cheltenham, pleased him. Also, Catherine enjoyed Cheltenham life, and the family split its time between the beauty of the Berkeley countryside and sophisticated town life. The family had also increased its number with the birth of a second son, Robert, in 1797, a year after the vaccination of James Phipps. Vaccination, as a medical term, has since become a blanket title for any inoculation to give immunity against disease. Jenner used the word vaccination to clearly differentiate his use of cowpox against smallpox as opposed to variolation, which described inoculation using smallpox. It did take some time for vaccination to emerge as the accepted term for Jenner's work. Cowpox inoculation, vaccine inoculation, cowpoxing and vacciolation being some of the alternatives. Having been successful once with vaccination, Jenner was keen to test his theory more fully. The only problem was the lack of cowpox infections from which to obtain his vaccine. This was very frustrating, particularly as Jenner had been noticing other related pox-like infections. There was an outbreak of horsepox, which infected horses' feet, and Jenner saw a connection between this and cowpox. Jenner was aware that the men who handled the infected horses were sometimes called upon to milk the cows, with an outbreak of cowpox often being the result. Jenner speculated that horsepox was in fact the originating source of cowpox. Consequently, when 3 local men developed horsepox infections in March of 1798, Jenner again put observation to the test, taking infected material, which he used to vaccinate a child. The child developed the symptoms of cowpox, giving credence to Jenner's theory. However, shortly after, quite predictably, cowpox developed on the same farm that had suffered the horsepox infection. By the April of 1798, Jenner had sufficient cowpox material to start a programme of vaccinations. Jenner realised that by taking material from humans with cowpox, he eliminated the need to have infected cows always available. He began a series of transmissions from human to human, with the last recipient proving to be as resistant to smallpox as the first. At this stage, there were naturally patients who preferred the old, well-established method of variolation, which, as a doctor, Jenner would have administered throughout his career. It was one such case that helped to prove beyond doubt that vaccination really did work. Some years previously, Henry, Jenner's nephew, forgiven for the cuckoo research, and having trained as a surgeon apothecary, had become his uncle's assistant. Henry often performed vaccinations on Jenner's behalf, and when he vaccinated 7-year-old J. Barge, circumstances were to provide a first-class control experiment. Young J. Barge developed cowpox in satisfactory fashion, after which Henry variolated. At the same time, another patient requested variolation, and Henry obliged with the same batch of smallpox matter that had been used for J. Barge. When Edward Jenner saw the results, he would have been delighted at his assistant's work, because J. Barge withstood the smallpox infection, protected by his vaccination, but the unprotected patient, in Jenner's own words, developed smallpox in the usual regular manner. This case was to conclude Jenner's first pamphlet, presenting evidence that the variolae vaccinae, a Latin name invented by Jenner meaning smallpox of the cow, could offer protection against smallpox. Jenner was eager to take his findings to medical colleagues in London, setting off on the 24th of April with the manuscript of his paper, Drawings of Cowpox Pustules and Vaccine Lymph from Hannah XL, dried on a quill. Catherine Jenner accompanied her husband on this occasion, despite her delicate health, possibly due to her fondness for London life. They stayed for 3 months, with Catherine's requirements being better served than her husband's. Jenner was unable to find anyone prepared to let him demonstrate vaccination. Eventually, he left the quill of dried vaccine with Henry Klein, a friend from his days with Hunter, who had become a surgeon at St. Thomas's Hospital. This would not be the only occasion where Jenner would return to Gloucestershire disappointed with the reactions of the medical experts of the day. It was something he would have to come to terms with if he was ever to succeed in his quest to eradicate smallpox. Henry Klein had read Jenner's manuscript with interest, but his decision to use the dried vaccine was completely unrelated to Jenner's theories. About 2 weeks after Edward and Catherine had left London for Cheltenham, Klein had a young patient suffering with a hip problem. Remembering that medicine was in its infancy, the concept of using counter-irritation was quite common. As Klein had found other methods of treatment unsuccessful, he decided that an infection of cowpox might help the child. The inoculation was made into the affected hip rather than the arm, and although the treatment did nothing for the hip complaint, Klein decided to test Jenner's theory. When the child was given smallpox matter in variolation, the infection was resisted. Henry Klein was convinced and became a supporter of vaccination. Jenner was well aware that there was still much to be done, and he ended the inquiry with these words: "I shall myself continue to prosecute this inquiry, encouraged by the hope of its becoming essentially beneficial to mankind." Beneficial to mankind maybe, but for the variolators, Benjamin Moseley and William Rowley, their own financial benefits were now under threat. They'd kept their methods secret and made handsome profits from their work. Cartoons like this one, in the style of James Gilray, were the result of their propaganda as they attempted to prevent the acceptance of vaccination. There was a great deal of confusion amongst the general public, and the idea of mixing animal matter with humans had worrying connotations. Every aspect of medicine was scientifically new, and surgery was a practice which the majority avoided wherever possible. Any treatment was viewed with suspicion because it often involved more discomfort than the original complaint. Disease was sometimes considered a retribution from God in an unforgiving religious climate. Syphilis was not surprisingly looked upon as such and was known as the Great Pox, differentiating it from the smallpox. This gives some explanation as to why a disease as appalling as smallpox should be so inadequately named. By comparison, the symptoms and the diabolical 18th century treatments of syphilis were devastating. At least a proportion of smallpox sufferers recovered. With syphilis, the outcome was more predictable. Jenner needed his theories to be proved by others, but this created problems which he had not anticipated.
Typical of such problems were the experiments performed at the London smallpox and inoculation hospitals in 1799. Dr. William Woodville obtained cowpox material from an animal at a dairy in Gray's Inn Lane. He used it to inoculate 8 patients. He then tested these patients with smallpox matter, but in 3 of these patients he waited only 5 days between the 2 treatments, too soon for the cowpox to have given any protection. Woodville then used matter from these patients to inoculate a further 600 patients. In this way, his so-called cowpox lymph quickly became contaminated with smallpox, producing many cases of smallpox among those he treated. Such setbacks were readily publicised by Jenner's opponents. In the face of these problems, Jenner gathered together further data. During the next 3 years, he published 3 follow-up pamphlets that not only strengthened his scientific case, but also gave sound advice on ways of avoiding false results. He gave full descriptions of those diseases of cows that could be confused with true cowpox. Additionally, he cautioned that correct storage of the vaccine material was essential lest it lose its power. Again, decades ahead of scientific thinking, he was advocating techniques that avoided infection of the vaccine sites with bacteria. The medical establishment found Jenner's mounting evidence incontrovertible. At last, he began to receive the support that he deserved. But I wonder how many people at that time appreciated the prophetic words with which he ended his 1801 publication. 100,000 persons, upon the smallest computation, have been inoculated in these realms. The number who have partaken of its benefits throughout Europe and other parts of the globe are incalculable, and it now becomes too manifest to admit of controversy that the annihilation of the smallpox, the most dreadful scourge of the human species, must be the final result of this practice.
All of Jenner's earlier work, his cuckoo observations and published papers had brought him recognition in his own circle of medical and social acquaintance. Jenner's reputation was enhanced, and his titled, moneyed Cheltenham clientele may well have increased. The publication of the Inquiry and Jenner's further work with smallpox were to win him international recognition and acclaim. The country doctor, who had been thought lacking in sufficient standing to marry into the Gloucestershire gentry, was now consulted by the royal family. Any discomfiture that Jenner had felt at the personal nature of attacks against him would have been soothed by an invitation from George III to wait upon him at St. James's Palace. So it was that on the 7th of March 1800, the Earl of Berkeley presented his friend and neighbour Edward Jenner, dressed in velvet and girt with a sword, to the King of England. The implications of this honour, coupled with Jenner's reception at Carlton House, the court of the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, put Jenner in a position of favour, whichever way the political wind was to blow. Despite this success, and the recognition Jenner received, life was by no means easy for him. Financially, Jenner was awarded £10,000 in 1802 by the government. England had been at war with revolutionary France and would later continue the conflict against Napoleon. Protecting the fighting forces against smallpox, whatever their nationality, would have been Jenner's only interest, and ironically, the French armies benefited greatly. It was pointed out at the time Jenner's award was made that as vaccination had saved the lives of perhaps 40,000 men, the Exchequer stood to gain about £200,000 in taxes that it would not otherwise have received. The sum of £10,000, although huge for the time, was insufficient for Jenner to continue his work in London. The expense of maintaining a London establishment away from his patients was prohibitive. Controversy was never far away, there being constant attacks on Jenner personally and professionally. The old dissenters, particularly the variolator Rowley, claimed that the smallpox was a visitation from God, a controller of the population, and not to be interfered with. Others claimed that Jenner was not the first to discover vaccination, with Benjamin Jesty being put forward as the originator. It was in these circumstances that Jenner found himself seriously facing bankruptcy, claiming, "I have to thank my stars that I have a little farm in Gloucestershire, where I shall at once repair and quit doctoring and turn ploughman." Jenner didn't become a ploughman, but he did return to Gloucestershire, to his roots and his medicine. Here, a young friend, Robert Ferryman, designed and supervised the building of a rustic hut in the garden at the Chantry. Jenner named it his Temple of Vaccinia and used the room once a week to vaccinate the poor of Berkeley and the surrounding countryside. It still stands undisturbed today, a testament to Jenner's determination after he had been forced to turn his back on London and the medical and political authorities. Although Jenner was not extravagant, when the government awarded him a further grant of £20,000 in 1807, it gave Jenner the security he rightly deserved, and most definitely needed to cover the costs of the work he had completed. It had been a very long, hard struggle, and at the age of 58, Jenner had achieved so much. He'd been awarded the freedom of the City of London, an honour shared by only 3 medical recipients, the other 2 being Florence Nightingale and Joseph Lister. Ordinary people praised Jenner. Mothers were grateful that their children were saved from the ravages of the speckled monster. Kind words and an elegant certificate did little to prevent Jenner's pain when he was criticised. He suffered greatly, and considering Jenner's intention had been only to improve the health of the world, he certainly paid a high price for the privilege. The retirement which Jenner had long promised himself brought little peace and great sadness. His eldest son, Edward, at the age of 21, was gravely ill. As a child, it was evident that he was mentally retarded, but it never diminished his parents' love for him. Jenner was too wise to have not been aware of his own helplessness to treat his son's TB. All he could do was watch and wait for the inevitable end. Jenner, who had cured the world of smallpox, could do nothing to save his own son. When Edward died on the 7th of February 1810, Jenner wrote to a friend saying, "I had no conception till it happened that the gash would have been so deep, but God's will be done. Tuberculosis was to strike Jenner yet another blow on the 13th of September 1815, with the death of his beloved wife Catherine after 27 years of marriage. As Jenner retreated to the Chantry to live out his final years in unexpected solitude, the repercussions of his discovery had reached many countries of the world. Napoleon himself had been so impressed and grateful to Jenner for the protected health of his army, he had released prisoners of war at Jenner's request. His comment was simply, "Ah, Jenner, I can refuse him nothing." Edward Jenner continued his work as a doctor right to the last. On the evening of the 24th of February 1823, he attended a Mr. Joyner Ellis, the local coroner, who had suffered a stroke. When he returned, he pronounced Mr. Ellis terminally ill before retiring to bed himself. The next day, when he did not appear for breakfast, Henry, the nephew of so many years' service to Jenner, found his uncle unconscious, himself the victim of a stroke. Edward Jenner never recovered consciousness, dying at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 26th of January 1823 at the age of 73. Ironically, his last patient, the coroner, survived Jenner by just a few hours. The funeral took place on the 3rd of February at Berkeley Church. Apart from family and friends, several mourners of the Gloucestershire Medical Faculty and the long grown-up James Phipps, no one came from London to pay their respects to one of the world's most influential doctors. This would have come as no surprise to Jenner, who had never been comfortable in his dealings with the medical establishment. Making speeches in front of large groups of his contemporaries from the world of medicine often made Jenner tongue-tied and reserved. He found it much easier to explain his theories to those he trusted in one-to-one situations, when his passion for his subject would have been evident to all. This may explain Jenner's tendency to return to his Berkeley home rather than tolerate the criticisms that accompanied his public image. It was never cowardice. Jenner just knew, in his heart, that he was right. My name is Jenner, Dr. Edward Jenner, and I am the vaccine clerk to the world. It's easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to hypothesize about how Jenner should have handled the presentation of his great discovery for greater personal glory. But the modesty of a man who called himself the vaccine clerk to the world would always have precluded it. The proof was there to be seen by everyone in 1798, and Jenner's work will stand any test of time for one very important reason. He achieved his ultimate goal, the complete eradication of smallpox.